A bride stands at Manhattan's most exclusive altar, clutching her bouquet as her fiancé grabs the microphone. He doesn't say, "I do." Instead, he introduces his wealthy new girlfriend to 500 stunned guests, smirking as the bride breaks down. It was a brutal high society humiliation, but karma has spectacular timing. 3 years later, that same humiliated girl brought the entire city to a standstill, escorted by a breathtaking royal convoy that made her arrogant ex look like a peasant. This is the ultimate revenge. The scent of 10,000 imported white orchids hung heavy in the vaulted grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. It was a suffocating, intoxicating perfume designed to project absolute wealth. Clara Higgins stood in the vestibule, smoothing the silk of her custom Vera Wang gown, her hands trembling so violently that the lace on her veil fluttered like a moth against a window pane. She was a girl from a middle-class family in Ohio, a talented but unassuming art restorer who had somehow captured the heart of Tristan Carmichael. The Carmichael family was New York royalty, or at least they desperately believed they were. They owned half the commercial real estate in Lower Manhattan, and Tristan's mother, Beatrice, wielded her checkbook like a blunt force weapon. From the very beginning, Beatrice had made her disdain for Clara brutally apparent. She had called Clara a charity case, a gold digger, and a temporary distraction. But Tristan had defended her. He had bought her a massive 3-carat diamond ring, kissed her in the rain on Fifth Avenue, and promised that none of the noise mattered. He had convinced Clara that their love was stronger than his family's toxic obsession with status. Or so she thought. As the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open, the murmurs of 500 of New York's elite faded into a tense, expectant silence. The string quartet began to play a sweeping cinematic march. Clara took a deep breath, clutching her bouquet of white peonies, and began the long walk down the aisle. The cameras of society, photographers flashed in the periphery, casting harsh, blinding lightning across the room. But as Clara's eyes adjusted, she looked at the end of the aisle. Tristan was standing there in a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo. But he wasn't smiling. His face was a mask of cold, calculated indifference. Beside him stood the priest, looking incredibly uncomfortable. Clara's steps faltered slightly. The energy in the room was wrong. It wasn't the warm, tearful joy of a wedding. It was the predatory silence of a coliseum, right before the lions were released. She finally reached the altar, offering a trembling smile to the man she loved. Tristan didn't take her hand. Instead, he turned to the priest and held up a hand, stopping the ceremony before it even began. Then Tristan reached into his jacket, pulled out a wireless microphone, and clicked it on. The sharp feedback echoed off the gold leaf ceiling. "I want to thank everyone for coming today." Tristan's voice boomed through the ballroom, eerily calm. "But there's not going to be a wedding. At least not the one you were expecting." Clara stared at him, her heart stopping in her chest. "Tristan, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice cracking. He didn't even look at her. He looked at the crowd. "For the last 2 years, I've been trying to force a square peg into a round hole. I tried to elevate someone who simply doesn't belong in our world. And my mother was right. You can't put a polished frame around a cheap painting and call it a masterpiece." A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Her vision tunneled. This had to be a nightmare. It was a cruel, twisted joke. "Tristan, please," Clara begged, her voice barely audible over the ringing in her ears. Tristan finally looked at her, his eyes devoid of any affection. "I'm sorry, Clara, but I woke up this morning and realized I couldn't spend the rest of my life apologizing for my wife's lack of pedigree." He gestured to the front row. "I realized I needed an equal." From the front pew, a woman stood up. It was Vanessa Rutherford, heiress to a billion-dollar shipping fortune, a woman Tristan had briefly dated before meeting Clara. Vanessa was wearing a sleek, inappropriate crimson designer dress, looking like a drop of blood against the sea of pastel wedding guests. She walked up the steps of the altar, an arrogant, predatory smirk plastered across her perfectly contoured face. Tristan wrapped his arm around Vanessa's waist and pulled her in, kissing her deeply, right in front of Clara. The ballroom erupted. Pandemonium broke loose. Cameras clicked furiously. Beatrice Carmichael sat in the front row, sipping a glass of champagne, a victorious, wicked smile on her face. Clara stood frozen. The man she loved, the man she had sacrificed her own peace of mind for, was completely destroying her on a live stage. The bouquet slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the marble floor with a soft thud. She turned and ran. She ran back up the aisle, tripping over the heavy silk train of her dress, the cruel laughter of Vanessa Rutherford echoing in her ears. She pushed through the heavy doors and fled out into the brutal, unforgiving rain of the Manhattan streets, a spectacle of absolute ruin, entirely unaware that a camera phone had recorded the entire speech. By morning, the video would have 10 million views. Clara Higgins wasn't just a jilted bride. She was the internet's most famous tragedy. The months that followed were a master class in survival. The video of Tristan's speech went globally viral, branded by tabloids as the billionaire's brutal breakup. Paparazzi camped outside Clara's modest apartment in Queens, forcing her to sneak out through the fire escape just to buy groceries. Worse still was the invisible hand of the Carmichael family. Beatrice, unsatisfied with merely breaking Clara's heart, wanted her utterly erased from their social sphere. Clara was abruptly fired from her position at a prestigious Chelsea art gallery. The owner, a man she had considered a mentor, couldn't look her in the eye when he handed her a severance check, muttering something about investors feeling uneasy with the negative press. Stripped of her dignity, her fiancé, and her career, Clara had every reason to shatter completely. Instead, she went into exile. She changed her phone number, deleted her social media, and moved to a small, drafty apartment in Brooklyn. She found salvation in the dust and quiet of a struggling antique bookstore and restoration shop in Williamsburg, owned by a kind elderly Russian immigrant named Mikhail. He didn't care about the tabloids or the elite. He only cared that Clara had a magical touch with damaged things. For 2 years, Clara lived in obscurity, breathing life back into water-damaged first editions and torn Renaissance sketches. She found peace in the smell of old leather-binding glue and Earl Grey tea. She was rebuilding herself page by page. And then on a rainy Tuesday in November, the bell above the shop door chimed. Clara didn't look up right away. She was meticulously repairing the spine of an 18th century French poetry book. "I'll be right with you," she called out. "Take your time," a voice replied. It was a rich baritone voice with a faint, unplaceable European lilt. When Clara finally wiped her hands on her apron and looked up, the breath hitched in her throat. The man standing across the counter was striking. He wasn't loud or flashy like the men of Tristan's world. He wore a simple, beautifully tailored charcoal overcoat, a slate gray cashmere turtleneck, and a pair of vintage tortoiseshell glasses. He had dark, messy hair and piercing, intelligent hazel eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the shop in a single glance. "I was told this is the only place in the city that can handle a 16th century vellum manuscript without turning it to dust," he said, setting a heavy, weather-beaten wooden box on the counter. "That depends on the manuscript," Clara said, her professional instincts kicking in. She opened the box. Inside was an astoundingly rare collection of maps from the Spanish Empire, severely water-damaged. "This is incredible, but it will take months of delicate work." "I am a very patient man," he smiled. "I'm Sebastian Beaufort." "Clara," she said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, warm, and calloused, uncharacteristic for a man in such expensive clothing. Over the next 6 months, Sebastian became a fixture in Clara's life. He would visit the shop twice a week to check on the progress of the manuscript, always bringing 2 cups of black coffee from a small, artisanal roaster down the street. He was an enigma. He claimed to work in international historical architecture, consulting on the restoration of old estates in Europe. He drove an unassuming 5-year-old Volvo SUV, but everything he owned, from his leather watch strap to his fountain pen, was of a quiet, staggering quality that possessed no logos or branding. They bonded over a shared love of obscure history, rainy afternoons, and quiet places. Unlike Tristan, who needed to be the center of every room, Sebastian preferred the edges. He listened to Clara with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only person on the planet. Eventually, the late-night coffees turned into dinners at hidden candlelit Italian restaurants in Brooklyn. For the first time in years, Clara laughed. A real, deep, unburdened laugh. One evening, while walking through the snow in Prospect Park, Sebastian gently brushed a snowflake from Clara's cheek. "You carry a very heavy ghost with you, Clara," he said softly. "I see it when you look at crowds." She had never told him about Tristan. She assumed he didn't know. Taking a deep breath, she told him the whole story. The Plaza Hotel. The microphone. Vanessa Rutherford. The viral humiliation. She braced herself for pity, or worse, the realization that she carried too much baggage. Instead, Sebastian stopped walking. He looked at her with a fierce, quiet anger that sent a shiver down her spine. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He reached out, took both of her hands in his, and brought them to his lips. "Fools trade diamonds for glass because they don't know how to look at the light," Sebastian whispered. "He didn't break you, Clara. He only proved that he was entirely unworthy of holding you." That night, under the glow of the street lamps, he kissed her. It erased everything. It erased the plaza, the cameras, and the humiliation. 2 years later, they were in Central Park. It was pouring rain, an unexpected summer, torrential downpour. They were huddled under a small gazebo, soaked to the bone, and laughing uncontrollably. Suddenly, Sebastian knelt on the wet cobblestones. He didn't have a photographer hiding in the bushes. He didn't have a grand audience. He pulled out a small, worn velvet box and opened it. Inside was a breathtaking, flawless vintage sapphire surrounded by intricate Art Deco diamonds. "This belonged to my grandmother," Sebastian said, looking up at her, the rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. "It has been in my family for a very long time. I want you to have it, Clara. I want you for the rest of my life." Tears streamed down Clara's face, mixing with the rain. "Yes," she choked out. "Yes, absolutely." She slipped the ring onto her finger. It was heavy, ancient, and perfect. She was going to marry a normal, wonderful man and live a quiet, beautiful life far away from the toxic wasteland of New York's high society. She had no idea how wrong she was about the normal part. New York City has a cruel sense of irony, and the tabloids never forget a good narrative. As Clara and Sebastian began quietly planning their wedding, the city was entirely consumed by another event. Tristan Carmichael and Vanessa Rutherford were finally tying the knot. The media had dubbed it the wedding of the decade. Every billboard, every gossip column, and every society magazine was dominated by their faces. They were spending a rumored $8 million on the affair, renting out the entirety of the New York Public Library's main branch on Fifth Avenue. Clara did her best to ignore it. She was happy. She had booked a beautiful, understated botanical garden in the Bronx for her and Sebastian's wedding, inviting only 50 close friends, including Mikhail, the bookstore owner. But the universe, it seemed, wasn't done testing her. It was 3 months before their respective weddings. Clara was standing in line at Dominique and Sell Bakery in Soho, waiting to pick up a box of delicate floral pastries to sample for her reception. She was wearing a simple trench coat, her sapphire ring glowing quietly on her left hand. The bell above the bakery door rang, and a loud, sharp voice cut through the quiet hum of the cafe. "I told you, Tristan, if the florist uses hydrangeas, I am firing the entire team. Hydrangeas are for peasants." Clara froze. The blood turned to ice in her veins. She slowly turned her head. There, standing in the center of the bakery, demanding the manager's immediate attention, was Vanessa Rutherford, draped in a full-length chinchilla coat, despite it being a mild autumn day. Beside her stood Tristan, looking older, more tired, but just as arrogantly polished in a sharp navy suit. Clara turned her back, pulling her collar up, praying they wouldn't notice her. But Tristan's eyes, trained to survey rooms for status, landed on her. He paused, a cruel, familiar smirk spread across his face. "Well, well, if it isn't the runaway bride," Tristan announced loudly. The entire bakery went dead silent. Clara took a deep breath, composed herself, and turned around. "Hello, Tristan. Vanessa. Congratulations on your upcoming wedding." She kept her voice perfectly level, a portrait of grace. Vanessa stepped forward, her eyes scanning Clara up and down with visceral disgust. Her gaze caught the sapphire on Clara's hand. Vanessa let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter. "Oh my God, Tristan, look." Vanessa pointed a manicured finger bearing a diamond the size of a golf ball. "She found someone to settle for her. What is that vintage? Did you get it at a pawn shop in Queens, Clara?" Tristan chuckled, leaning against the pastry counter. "I'm glad you landed on your feet, Clara. Truly, I suppose every tragedy needs a mediocre ending." "Who is the lucky guy? A barista? An Uber driver?" "He's an architect," Clara said firmly, her chin held high. "And he is a better man than you could ever comprehend." Tristan scoffed, stepping into Clara's personal space, trying to physically intimidate her. "Right. Well, since you're getting married, you should probably see how the real elite do it. Consider it an educational experience." He reached into his designer briefcase and pulled out a thick, gold-embossed envelope. He shoved it against Clara's chest, forcing her to take it. "We're getting married on October 12th, 5th Avenue. Tristan sneered. "Stop by. We might have some leftover cake you can take back to whatever basement you live in now." Clara looked at the envelope, then back up at Tristan. A sudden, chilling realization hit her. October 12th. It was the exact same day she and Sebastian had booked for their own wedding. Without a word, Clara walked past them, leaving her pastries behind, and stepped out into the crisp New York air. She didn't cry. The tears she had shed for Tristan had dried up years ago, but her hands shook with a potent, boiling anger. The audacity. The endless, relentless cruelty. When she returned to her apartment, Sebastian was sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing blueprints with a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose. He took one look at Clara's face and immediately stood up, the blueprints scattering across the floor. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low and instantly protective. Clara threw the gold-embossed envelope onto the table. She recounted the entire encounter, her voice shaking with residual adrenaline. She told him about the mockery, the ring, the invitation, and the date. Sebastian stood in silence, staring at the golden crest of the Carmichael family on the envelope. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The gentle, quiet man Clara had known for 2 years vanished, replaced by something entirely different, something cold, commanding, and infinitely dangerous. "October 12th, Sebastian murmured. "The same day as ours." "Sebastian, we just have to ignore them," Clara said, reaching for his arm. "They want a reaction. They want me to feel small. I won't let them." Sebastian looked at Clara, his hazel eyes completely devoid of warmth. "You will never feel small again, Clara. Not in this city. Not anywhere on this earth." He picked up the invitation, tore it neatly in half, and dropped it into the trash can. "The botanical garden is cancelled," Sebastian said flatly, pulling his phone from his pocket. Clara blinked in shock. "What, Sebastian? No, I love that venue." "Clara, do you trust me?" he asked, turning to her, his voice softening just a fraction, but the steel underneath remaining resolute. "Of course I trust you, but—" "Then let me handle our wedding," he said. "I wanted to give you a quiet life, Clara, because I thought that was what you wanted. But these people, they understand only one language: power. And it is time they learn exactly who they just insulted." Before Clara could ask what he meant, Sebastian dialed a number on his phone. He walked toward the window, looking out over the Brooklyn skyline toward the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan. "Mother." Sebastian spoke into the phone. His tone was entirely different now. It was formal, authoritative, dripping with an aristocratic command Clara had never heard before. "It's Sebastian. Yes, I've decided to use the family crest for the wedding." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. A sharp, predator's smile touched his lips. "Yes, full protocol. We are moving the venue. Tell the ambassador to contact the mayor's office. I want the airspace over Manhattan cleared, and contact the Royal Guard. We're bringing the convoy to New York." Clara stood frozen in the center of her small kitchen, her jaw practically hitting the floor. The royal guard. Sebastian hung up the phone and turned back to Clara, the dangerous smile fading into a look of absolute, unconditional devotion. "Clara Higgins," Sebastian said softly, "how do you feel about wearing a crown?" The silence in the small Brooklyn kitchen was deafening. Clara stared at Sebastian, her mind desperately trying to process the words that had just left his mouth. Royal Guard, ambassador, airspace. These were not words that belonged in the vocabulary of a quiet restoration architect who drove a 5-year-old Volvo. "Sebastian," Clara whispered, her voice trembling, "what exactly are you talking about?" He walked slowly back to her, taking her shaking hands in his. The warmth in his eyes was still there, but it was anchored by a formidable, undeniable authority that Clara had never seen before. "My full name is Sebastian Arthur Louis Beaufort," he said gently, articulating each syllable. "I am the crown prince of the sovereign principality of Beaufort-Leopold, a sovereign state bordering France and Switzerland. The architecture firm is Real Clara. It is a holding company for the crown's real estate portfolio. I came to New York to escape the pressure of the throne, to live a quiet life before I formally ascend." Clara swayed slightly on her feet. The room spun. She looked down at the heavy vintage sapphire on her left hand. "The ring," she breathed. "The Leopold sapphire." Sebastian confirmed, a small smile playing on his lips. "Gifted to my great-grandmother by Tsar Nicholas II in 1912. It is the official engagement ring of the future queen consort." Clara pulled her hands away, stepping back until her spine hit the refrigerator. "You're a prince, a literal, actual prince, and you let me split the bill at the diner on Tuesday. Sebastian, this is madness. I'm an art restorer from Ohio. I can't be a royal. Tristan's family already tore me to shreds for not having a trust fund. What is a royal court going to do to me?" Sebastian closed the distance between them, framing her face with his hands. "My family is not the Carmichaels, Clara. My mother, Queen Genevieve, knows all about you. She knows about the humility, the grace, and the resilience you showed when the world was cruel to you. She loves you already. You are exactly what our family needs. You are exactly what I need." He kissed her forehead, a promise sealed in silence. "I wanted to spare you the circus of a royal wedding, but Tristan and Vanessa have made this a matter of public disrespect. In my family, we do not allow our future queen to be mocked by local aristocrats playing dress-up." Within 48 hours, Clara's life transformed into a surreal, high-stakes military operation. The quiet cobblestone street outside her Williamsburg apartment was suddenly lined with black armored Cadillac Escalades bearing diplomatic plates. Stern-looking men and women wearing earpieces and bespoke suits secured the perimeter. The most jarring arrival was that of Madame Dupont, the royal household's chief of protocol, a terrifyingly chic Parisian woman who descended upon Clara's living room with an army of assistants, iPads, and measuring tapes. "The botanical garden is unequivocally cancelled," Madame Dupont announced, barely looking up from her tablet as she dismissed Clara's previous plans with a wave of her perfectly manicured hand. "His Serene Highness has spoken with the Archbishop of New York. The ceremony will take place at St. Patrick's Cathedral on 5th Avenue. Clara gasped. "St. Patrick's on October 12th, but that's exactly 7 blocks north of the New York Public Library, where Mr. Carmichael is hosting his little soiree," Sebastian said, entering the room, holding a cup of espresso. He looked entirely in his element, the quiet architect replaced by a man born to command. "Fifth Avenue will be shut down. A full royal motorcade requires absolute security. The NYPD and the State Department have already approved the permits." Clara felt a dizzying mixture of terror and fierce, undeniable vindication. She remembered Tristan's cruel smirk in the bakery. She remembered Vanessa's mocking laugh. "What about the dress?" Clara asked, looking at Madame Dupont. "Vera Wang is for high society, darling." Madame Dupont sniffed dismissively. "You are marrying a head of state. The House of Dior has already opened their private archives in Paris for you. We fly out tonight." In the glittering cutthroat world of Manhattan's ultra-wealthy, information is currency and prestige is oxygen. Or, for Beatrice Carmichael, Tristan's mother, her son's wedding was supposed to be her crowning achievement. She had spent 2 years and nearly $8 million orchestrating a spectacle that would permanently cement the Carmichael family at the apex of New York society. The New York Public Library was secured. The legendary event planner Preston Bailey was designing the floral arrangements. A 50-piece symphony orchestra was flown in from Vienna. It was flawlessly arrogant. But 3 weeks before the October 12th date, the foundation of Beatrice's empire began to crack. It started with a phone call from the mayor's office of special events. Tristan was sitting in his corner office overlooking Wall Street when his assistant patched the call through. "Mr. Carmichael, I'm calling regarding your permits for the Fifth Avenue street closures for your valet staging." The city official said, his tone unusually clipped. "We're going to have to revoke them." Tristan sat up, his brow furrowing. "Excuse me, we paid $250,000 in city fees for those permits. You can't revoke them. I'll have the mayor on the phone in 5 minutes." "You can call the mayor, Mr. Carmichael, but it won't change anything," the official replied dryly. "The State Department and the Secret Service have overridden local jurisdiction. A Category 1 diplomatic security zone is being established on Fifth Avenue. On October 12th, an allied sovereign head of state is getting married at St. Patrick's Cathedral on the same afternoon." Tristan's blood ran cold. "A royal wedding in New York. Who?" "That information is classified under diplomatic embargo until the day of the event," the official stated. "But Fifth Avenue will be heavily barricaded from 42nd Street to 59th Street. No civilian vehicles. Your guests will have to pass through Secret Service checkpoints just to walk to the library." Before Tristan could fully process this catastrophic logistical nightmare, his private line rang. It was Vanessa, and she was in hysterics. Preston Bailey just backed out. Vanessa shrieked into the phone, the sound of breaking glass echoing in the background. He sent back our deposit. He said his firm was contractually commandeered by a royal household, and he is legally obligated to prioritize them. Kutcher. City wonderful. "Calm down, Vanessa," Tristan snapped, massaging his temples. "We'll get someone else. We'll get—" "It's not just Preston," she sobbed. "The catering company Daniel Boulud's team just canceled. They were hired by the European delegation for a state dinner the night before Tristan. Our wedding is falling apart. Who the hell is getting married?" The chaos didn't stop at the vendors. The true devastation came from the guest list. The Carmichaels had invited 500 of the most powerful people in America: tech billionaires, senators, hedge fund managers, and media moguls. But in the ruthless hierarchy of the global elite, a billionaire is nothing compared to royalty. Whispers of the mystery royal wedding at St. Patrick's Cathedral had saturated the upper echelons of society. And then, the heavy gold-leafed royal summonses were delivered. Only 300 elite Americans were invited to join the European aristocracy at St. Patrick's. It was the most exclusive, coveted invitation in a century. Slowly, agonizingly, Tristan and Beatrice began receiving RSVPs, declines. The CEO of a major investment bank declined. The governor of New York declined. The editor-in-chief of Vogue declined. They were all jumping ship to attend the royal wedding happening 7 blocks away. Beatrice Carmichael paced her Park Avenue penthouse like a caged leopard, violently swirling a glass of scotch. "This is a targeted attack," she hissed to Tristan, who sat on the velvet sofa, looking utterly defeated. "Someone is doing this on purpose to humiliate us, to drain our guest list." "Mother, they are royalty," Tristan said, running a hand through his hair. "They don't know who we are. They don't care about us. It's just a geographical coincidence, a horrible, catastrophic coincidence." "I refuse to be embarrassed, Tristan," Beatrice snarled. "We are the Carmichaels. We will have our wedding, and we will make sure the press covers us, not some obscure foreign prince." Little did they know, the press had already been heavily briefed by Madame Dupont. Every major news network, from CNN to the BBC, had set up broadcast tents outside St. Patrick's Cathedral. The Carmichael wedding at the library had been entirely eclipsed, relegated to a minor local footnote. In a luxury suite at the Plaza Hotel, the very hotel where she had been humiliated 3 years ago, Clara stood on a pedestal surrounded by Parisian tailors. She wore a custom Dior haute couture gown, crafted from miles of ivory silk, ratzamir embroidered with thousands of microscopic pearls that formed the crest of the Beaufort-Leopold family. Sebastian sat in a velvet armchair sipping tea, watching her with a look of profound adoration. "The mayor's office just confirmed the barricades," Sebastian said casually, checking a gold pocket watch. "No civilian traffic will be allowed near the library. Tristan's remaining guests will have to walk 3 blocks in their evening wear through a heavily armed checkpoint." Clara looked at him in the mirror. A small, wicked smile touched her lips. "Is it wrong that I feel absolutely no pity for them?" "Pity is for those who make mistakes," Sebastian replied, his hazel eyes flashing with a dangerous protective fire. "They didn't make a mistake, Clara. They made a choice to destroy you. And now they get to witness your resurrection." October 11th, the eve of the wedding. Manhattan felt electric. The city that never sleeps was practically vibrating with anticipation. European flags bearing the golden lion and crown of Beaufort-Leopold hung from every lamppost along Fifth Avenue, snapping in the crisp autumn wind. Armed tactical units and Interpol agents patrolled the streets seamlessly, blending with the NYPD. The Carmichael rehearsal dinner at Le Bernardin was a funeral masquerading as a celebration. The room was half empty. The symphony orchestra they had scrambled to replace was out of tune. Vanessa sat at the head of the table in a white Chanel suit, glaring at her untouched caviar, her eyes red from crying. "I heard it's the Crown Prince of Beaufort-Leopold," a gossiping bridesmaid whispered loudly from down the table. "They say he's marrying an American, an absolute nobody, a commoner." Tristan clenched his jaw so tightly his teeth ached. A commoner. Some random American girl was stealing the greatest day of his life, stealing the spotlight he had paid $8 million for. "Enough!" Tristan snapped, slamming his fist on the table. The crystal glasses rattled. "Tomorrow is our day. I don't care about some archaic European snob. The library will look incredible, and we will ignore the circus outside." But the circus was unavoidable. The next morning, October 12th, dawned with brilliant, cloudless blue skies. The air was cold and sharp. By 10 a.m., the entirety of Fifth Avenue was effectively locked down. Massive steel barricades lined the sidewalks. Thousands of New Yorkers and tourists pressed against the barriers, waving flags, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious American commoner who was about to become a queen. At 1 p.m., Tristan stood inside the vestibule of the New York Public Library, adjusting his bespoke tuxedo. The vast marble halls of the library echoed with an uncomfortable emptiness. They had expected 500 guests. Barely 200 had shown up. Most of Vanessa's extended family had been delayed at the security checkpoints, forced to trudge through the streets in their designer heels after their limousines were aggressively turned away by Secret Service agents. "Where is the press?" Vanessa hissed, peering through the heavy glass doors of the library out onto the empty street. "Tristan, there isn't a single photographer out there. They're all up at 50th Street. Beatrice said, her voice dripping with venom as she approached them. She looked haggard, her usual ironclad composure fracturing. "Every single camera in this city is pointed at St. Patrick's." Tristan gritted his teeth, looking out at the heavily armed police line that blocked their venue from the rest of the world. He felt entirely powerless. For the first time in his privileged life, his money, his name, and his mother's influence meant absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, inside the presidential suite of the Waldorf Astoria, Clara was taking her final breaths as a private citizen. She stood before a massive gilded mirror. The Dior gown fit her like a second skin, elegant and impossibly regal. The long, dramatic train pooled around her feet like liquid moonlight. Madame Dupont approached carefully, carrying a velvet cushion. Resting on the cushion was a diamond tiara. It was not a delicate, modern piece of jewelry. It was a heavy, staggering historical artifact, the Beaufort diamond-fringed tiara, worn by every queen consort since the 18th century. "May I, Your Highness?" Madame Dupont asked, her voice hushed with reverence. Clara nodded slowly. As the tiara was pinned into her dark hair, she felt the literal weight of her new life settling upon her. She looked at her reflection. She didn't look like the terrified girl in the Vera Wang dress 3 years ago. She didn't look like the broken girl hiding in a dusty Brooklyn bookstore. She looked unyielding. She looked like royalty. There was a soft knock on the door. Mikhail, the elderly bookstore owner from Williamsburg, stepped into the room. He was wearing a rented tuxedo that was slightly too large for him, looking incredibly out of place, but beaming with overwhelming pride. Since Clara's father had passed away years ago, she had asked Mikhail to walk her down the aisle. "My dear," Mikhail whispered, wiping a tear from his eye, You look like a painting that belongs in the Louvre." Clara smiled, linking her arm through his. "Thank you, Mikhail. Are you ready for this?" "I am ready to see the world finally realize what I've known for years," he replied warmly. Downstairs, the royal convoy awaited. It was a staggering display of power. A dozen black-armored Mercedes Maybachs were lined up, flanked by an escort of 30 NYPD motorcycle officers and members of the elite Royal Guard on horseback, wearing ceremonial crimson uniforms and plumed helmets. Clara and Mikhail stepped into the central vehicle, heavily tinted and bomb-proof. All units' packages secured. The lead Secret Service agent spoke into his radio. "Initiate the motorcade. Move down 5th Avenue." The convoy roared to life. The sirens wailed a piercing, triumphant sound that echoed through the concrete canyons of Manhattan. As the motorcade pulled onto the cleared expanse of 5th Avenue, the roar of the crowd swelled. Thousands of people cheered, waving from behind the barricades. Clara looked out the tinted window, her heart pounding against her ribs. The convoy moved smoothly, gliding past the towering skyscrapers. And then she saw it. As they approached 42nd Street, the motorcade purposefully slowed down. Sebastian had meticulously arranged the route. To get to St. Patrick's Cathedral from the Waldorf, they had to drive directly past the New York Public Library. Clara leaned closer to the glass. Standing on the grand marble steps of the library, trapped behind a velvet rope and a line of unsmiling NYPD officers, were Tristan Carmichael, Vanessa Rutherford, and Beatrice Carmichael. They were looking out at the convoy, their faces masks of sheer frustration, anger, and awe. They were watching the royal spectacle completely unaware of who was inside the car. Clara pressed a button on the armrest. The heavy bulletproof window of her Maybach smoothly rolled down just a few inches. Just enough for the sunlight to catch the diamonds of her tiara. Just enough for the world to see her face. As the car rolled past the library at a crawling 5 miles per hour, Clara turned her head and locked eyes directly with Tristan Carmichael. Time seemed to stop. Tristan's arrogant scowl faltered. His eyes widened, his pupils dilating in sheer, unadulterated shock. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He stumbled backwards slightly, bumping into Vanessa, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Beatrice Carmichael gasped, her hand flying to her throat, as she recognized the face of the charity case she had mercilessly thrown away, now draped in diamonds, escorted by an army and wearing a crown. Clara didn't sneer. She didn't laugh. She offered them a slow, cold, utterly indifferent nod. It was the nod of a monarch acknowledging her subjects. Then she rolled the window back up, sealing them out. The motorcade accelerated, leaving the Carmichaels choking on the exhaust fumes, utterly paralyzed by the monumental realization of what they had just witnessed. Tristan realized in that agonizing split second that he hadn't just lost a good woman. He had made himself the villain in the story of a queen, and in the brutal arena of high society, he was now officially less than nothing. Clara leaned back into the plush leather seat, the adrenaline singing in her veins. Ahead of her, the towering spires of St. Patrick's Cathedral reached into the blue sky. The massive bronze doors were open, and waiting for her at the end of the aisle was a man who didn't care about the cameras, the crowds, or the revenge. He just cared about her. The heavy bronze doors of St. Patrick's Cathedral stood open, framing a scene of unimaginable, breathtaking grandeur. As Clara stepped out of the bomb-proof Maybach, the roar of the crowds lining Fifth Avenue was deafening. Thousands of people pressed against the NYPD barricades, cell phones raised high, trying to capture the first glimpse of the mysterious American commoner who had commanded a royal fleet. Clara stood at the base of the cathedral steps, the crisp autumn wind catching the sprawling pearl-encrusted train of her custom Dior gown. The Beaufort diamond-fringed tiara rested flawlessly in her dark hair, catching the afternoon sunlight and fracturing it into 1,000 prisms of light. Mikhail, trembling with awe, offered her his arm. "Are you ready, Your Highness?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Clara looked up at the towering Gothic spires of the cathedral. The girl who had run out of the Plaza Hotel 3 years ago, sobbing and humiliated in a cheap veil, was dead. In her place stood a woman, forged in the fires of survival, now draped in the armor of kings. "I have never been more ready," Clara replied, her voice steady and resolute. As they crossed the threshold into the cathedral, the sensory impact was staggering. The air was thick with the scent of burning frankincense and thousands of imported white gardenias. St. Patrick's had been transformed into a European royal court. The pews were filled with 300 of the most powerful people on the planet. Clara recognized the faces she had only ever seen on television or the covers of Time magazine. There were foreign dignitaries dripping in ceremonial sashes, tech billionaires and legendary media tycoons. Anna Wintour sat on the third row, her signature sunglasses removed, in a rare show of respect, watching intently. But Clara's eyes bypassed all of them. At the end of the aisle stood Sebastian. He was no longer the quiet architect in a charcoal overcoat. He was the crown prince of Beaufort Leopold, wearing the immaculate midnight blue ceremonial military dress of his nation. Gold epaulets rested on his broad shoulders, and a sash of deep crimson slashed across his chest, adorned with the highest medals of his family's dynasty. He looked incredibly formidable, a man who commanded armies and economies with a single word. Yet as Clara began her walk down the aisle, to the soaring, thunderous chords of the cathedral's massive pipe organ, Sebastian's severe expression melted. His hazel eyes filled with a terrifyingly pure, unguarded devotion. The royal facade dropped just for her. He was still the man who had brought her black coffee on rainy Tuesdays in Brooklyn. They reached the altar, and Mikhail gently placed Clara's hand in Sebastian's. "You look like a queen," Sebastian whispered, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "You look like a conqueror," Clara whispered back, a faint smile on her lips. The Archbishop of New York conducted the ceremony in a mesmerizing blend of English and Latin. There was no theatrical, cruel microphone grab. There was no smirking heiress in the front row. There was only the solemn, unbreakable weight of ancient vows. When Sebastian slipped the heavy platinum wedding band onto Clara's finger, completing the Tsar's sapphire, a profound silence fell over the cathedral. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Archbishop declared, his voice echoing off the vaulted stone ceilings. "May I be the first to present to the world His Serene Highness Prince Sebastian and Her Serene Highness Princess Clara of Beaufort Leopold." Sebastian leaned in, taking Clara's face in his hands, and kissed her. It wasn't a polite, aristocratic peck. It was a fierce, passionate claim that sent a shockwave through the cathedral. The guests erupted into applause, a sophisticated but undeniable roar of approval. At that exact moment, just 7 blocks south, Tristan Carmichael stood at the altar of the New York Public Library. The contrast was pathetic. The vast marble hall of the library felt like a mausoleum. Barely 200 guests sat scattered among the 500 gold Chiavari chairs. The extravagant floral arches looked absurd in the half-empty room. There was no orchestra. A hastily hired local string quartet was attempting to play Pachelbel's canon, but the cellist was out of tune. Tristan held Vanessa's hands, but his mind was utterly blank. His pulse was roaring in his ears. Every time he blinked, all he could see was Clara's face in the back of that Maybach, staring at him with cold, untouchable pity. The diamond tiara. The NYPD escort. The staggering realization that the mystery royal wedding that had systematically destroyed his perfect day belonged to the woman he had publicly thrown away like garbage. Tristan, Vanessa hissed under her breath, squeezing his hand so hard her manicured nails dug into his skin. Pay attention, the officiant asked you a question. Tristan blinked, snapping back to reality. The officiant, a highly paid celebrity minister, was looking at him expectantly. Do you, Tristan, take Vanessa? The minister repeated, clearing his throat. I do, Tristan muttered mechanically. He felt nothing. No joy, no triumph, just a hollow, creeping sense of doom. When they walked back up the aisle, there were no cheers. The few guests who had shown up were distracted, secretly glancing at their cell phones beneath their programs. Vanessa dragged Tristan into the library's Astor Hall for the reception, her face flushed with fury. This is a disaster, she screamed the moment they were out of earshot. Half my family is stuck behind Secret Service checkpoints. The caviar is warm because the caterers quit, and no one is paying attention to us. Where is the press? Tristan, where is Vanity Fair? Tristan didn't answer. He reached into his tuxedo jacket, pulled out his phone, and opened Twitter. He didn't have to search for it. It was the #1 trending topic worldwide. The internet had exploded. It was a media earthquake that shattered every social media algorithm on the planet. CNN had run the breaking news alert first. American Cinderella, the mystery princess of Beaufort Leopold, revealed. Within minutes, investigative journalists and internet sleuths had connected the dots. The pristine, regal woman walking down the aisle of St. Patrick's Cathedral on live television was Clara Higgins. The internet never forgets. Almost instantly, split-screen images began flooding every platform. On the left, the viral video of Clara crying in her Vera Wang dress at the Plaza Hotel 3 years ago, being humiliated by Tristan's cruel speech. On the right, Clara today, draped in Dior haute couture and the Beaufort diamond fringe tiara, surrounded by European monarchs. The narrative was too perfect. It was the ultimate real-life revenge fantasy, and the public consumed it with a ravenous hunger. The hashtag the Queen's Revenge was tweeted 4 million times in 2 hours. Tristan stared at his phone screen, his hands shaking violently. The Wall Street Journal had just published an article From Jilted Bride to Royal Highness, the monumental rise of Clara Higgins. What are you looking at? Vanessa snatched the phone from his hands. She read the headline, her perfectly contoured face contorting in sheer horror. She scrolled down, seeing the side-by-side photos. No, Vanessa gasped, the color draining from her cheeks. No, this is impossible. She's an art restorer. She lives in Brooklyn. How did she... She didn't marry a barista, Tristan whispered, his voice cracking. She married the crown prince. That ring, the sapphire. Vanessa, we mocked a future queen to her face. Oh. Across the room, Beatrice Carmichael was frantically typing on her phone, trying to call the editor-in-chief of Vogue to demand they send a photographer to the library. The call went straight to voicemail. Beatrice looked around the room. The guests, who had bothered to show up, were now huddled in small groups, staring at their phones, whispering and pointing at Tristan. The Carmichael family was no longer the apex predators of New York society. They were the punchline of a global joke. They were the arrogant fools who had thrown away a diamond and settled for a cheap plastic imitation. By 6 p.m., the library reception was hemorrhaging guests. People were faking illnesses, claiming family emergencies, and fleeing out the side doors. They all wanted to be seen anywhere but near the Carmichaels. Being associated with the people who had bullied the new darling of the global stage was social suicide. But social suicide was only the beginning. Sebastian was not a man who fought half measures. Later that evening, the royal wedding reception took over the entirety of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The iconic stone steps of the Met were covered in a crimson carpet lined with royal guards standing at attention. Sit inside under the soaring glass ceilings of the Charles Engelhard Court, 1,000 guests drank vintage Dom Perignon and danced to a private performance by Andrea Bocelli. Clara had changed into a sleeker, floor-length silk reception gown, a delicate diamond choker replacing the heavy tiara. She was glowing, floating through the room on Sebastian's arm, receiving congratulations from diplomats and tycoons. Sebastian leaned down his lips, brushing her ear. "Are you enjoying the evening, my princess?" "It feels like a dream," Clara murmured, resting her head against his shoulder. "But I have to admit, a small part of me is wondering what is happening downtown." Sebastian's smile turned razor sharp. Downtown is currently experiencing a restructuring. He gestured to a tall, silver-haired man in a sharply tailored tuxedo, standing near the Temple of Dender. "Do you see Lord Harrington over there? He is my family's chief financial minister." Clara looked at the man, then back to Sebastian. "What did you do, Sebastian?" "The Carmichael family's wealth is entirely tied up in Manhattan. Commercial real estate," Sebastian explained quietly, his tone calm and lethal. "They boast about owning the city, but they don't own the land beneath their buildings. They hold 99-year ground leases. 3 of their flagship towers in the financial district are built on land owned by a blind European trust." Clara's eyes widened as she put the pieces together. "The holding company, your architecture firm." "Exactly." Sebastian nodded. "The Crown of Beaufort Leopold owns the ground leases, and as of 5 p.m. today, my financial minister has formally notified the Carmichael Corporation that we will not be renewing the leases. We are calling in the land." Clara gasped. "Sebastian, that will bankrupt them. They'll lose billions." "They will lose everything," Sebastian corrected coldly. "By Monday morning, their stock will plummet. The board of directors will force Tristan and his mother out of their own company to save whatever scraps are left." "I told you, Clara. They made a choice to destroy you. Now I am erasing them." It was a masterstroke of absolute power. Tristan hadn't just lost a social war. He had unwittingly provoked a sovereign entity that held the keys to his entire empire. At that exact moment, Tristan Carmichael was standing outside the NYPD barricades on 5th Avenue, 3 blocks away from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was pouring rain, an icy October downpour that mirrored the night he had left Clara at the plaza. His custom tuxedo was soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead. He had left Vanessa sobbing in the bridal suite of their hotel, driven by a manic, desperate need to see Clara, to somehow fix the catastrophic error he had made. He had bribed a taxi driver $1,000 just to get him as close to the Met as possible. He stood at the steel barricades, shivering, watching the flashing lights of the paparazzi and the golden glow emanating from the museum. He could see the silhouettes of the elite inside, laughing, dancing, existing in a world he was now permanently exiled from. "Hey buddy, step back," a burly NYPD officer ordered, shining a flashlight in Tristan's face. "You don't understand," Tristan slurred, his teeth chattering. "I'm Tristan Carmichael. I know her. I know the princess. I need to get inside." The officer let out a harsh bark of laughter. "Yeah, and I'm the King of England. Back away from the barricade, pal, before I lock you up for public intoxication. This is a Category 1 secure zone." Tristan gripped the cold steel of the barricade, his knuckles turning white. He stared up at the grand steps of the Met through the massive glass windows. For one fleeting, agonizing second, he saw her. Clara was standing on a balcony overlooking the main hall, laughing at something Sebastian had said. She looked radiant, powerful, and entirely untouchable. She was a goddess bathed in light, standing beside a man who was undeniably his superior in every conceivable way. Tristan opened his mouth to scream her name, to beg for forgiveness, to do anything to bridge the impossible chasm between them. But Clara didn't look out the window. She didn't look at the rain, and she certainly didn't look for him. She simply turned her back to the glass, disappearing into the warmth and the music of her new empire. Tristan Carmichael sank to his knees on the wet, filthy pavement of New York City, burying his face in his hands as the rain washed away the last remnants of his legacy. The destruction of the Carmichael family was swift, brutal, and thoroughly documented by the financial press. On Monday morning, as Sebastian had promised, the Beaufort Leopold Sovereign Trust publicly announced the termination of the Carmichael ground leases. Wall Street panicked. The Carmichael Corporation's stock lost 60% of its value in 4 hours. Beatrice Carmichael, the terrifying matriarch who had built her life on intimidation and exclusivity, suffered a highly publicized nervous breakdown in the lobby of her Park Avenue co-op when the co-op board, suddenly terrified of royal retaliation, voted to evict her. Vanessa Rutherford, ever the opportunistic survivor, filed for annulment exactly 72 hours after saying, "I do." She claimed emotional distress and fraud abandoning Tristan in the ashes of his ruined empire. Tristan was forced to resign as CEO, his name scrubbed from the brass plaques of the buildings he used to own. He moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in New Jersey, spending his days hiding from the relentless paparazzi who loved nothing more than a billionaire's spectacular fall from grace. But Clara did not stay in New York to gloat over the ruins. She had a country to run. 2 weeks after the wedding at St. Patrick's Cathedral, Clara and Sebastian boarded a private royal jet, leaving the chaotic skyline of Manhattan behind them forever. When Clara finally stepped off the plane onto the tarmac in Beaufort Leopold, she was greeted by the booming thunder of a 21-gun salute. The sovereign principality was nestled in a breathtaking valley between the French and Swiss Alps, a postcard of medieval castles, pristine glacial lakes, and elegant cobblestone cities. Tens of thousands of citizens had lined the streets of the capital, waving flags and throwing white roses at the royal motorcade. They had read the stories of the American girl who had overcome public humiliation with grace and dignity. They didn't see a commoner. They saw a survivor. They saw their queen. As they rode in an open-air carriage toward the Grand Ducal Palace, Sebastian reached out and took Clara's hand. "They love you," he said, smiling as the crowds chanted her name. "Princess Clara. Princess Clara." "I think they just like the tiara," Clara joked, though tears of overwhelming gratitude pricked at her eyes. "No," Sebastian said softly, kissing her knuckles. "They see what I see, a masterpiece." Clara's transition into royal life was seamless, largely because she refused to become a passive ornament. She didn't spend her days shopping or attending vapid socialite luncheons. Instead, she brought her true passion to the throne. Within her first year, Princess Clara established the Beaufort Royal Arts Foundation. She secured millions of euros in funding to restore damaged historical artifacts across Europe, employing hundreds of scholars, historians, and art restorers. She personally oversaw the restoration of a 14th-century cathedral in the capital, often showing up in overalls and a messy bun, climbing scaffolding to inspect the masonry alongside the workers. The people adored her for it. She was hailed as the working princess, a woman who wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty to preserve the beauty of the world. She also flew Mikhail out from Brooklyn, making him the official chief archivist of the Royal Library. The elderly Russian man wept when Clara handed him the keys to a vaulted room containing original manuscripts from the Renaissance, finally giving him the respect and resources he had deserved his entire life. 5 years later, on a crisp winter evening, Clara stood on the stone balcony of the Grand Ducal Palace, looking out over the snow-covered city. The bells of the cathedral were ringing in the distance, echoing through the Alpine Valley. She wore a thick white cashmere shawl over her shoulders, the Tsar's sapphire gleaming on her hand in the moonlight. Sebastian stepped out onto the balcony, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "The Prime Minister was very impressed with your speech at the summit today," Sebastian murmured, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. "The Prime Minister needs to stop cutting the budget for the national museums, or I will make my next speech a lot less polite." Clara laughed, leaning back against her husband's solid warmth. Sebastian chuckled, kissing the side of her neck. "A terrifying queen, just as I always knew you would be." Clara smiled, looking up at the millions of stars blanketing the sky. She thought briefly of the Plaza Hotel. She thought of the trembling girl in the Vera Wang dress standing at an altar made of broken glass, listening to a cruel man tell the world she wasn't good enough. Tristan had been right about one thing, though he had profoundly misunderstood the metaphor. You couldn't put a polished frame around a cheap painting and call it a masterpiece. Tristan was the cheap painting. He was a hollow, worthless facade wrapped in expensive gold leaf. But Clara was the artist. She was the one who knew how to take something broken and turn it into something breathtaking. She hadn't just survived the greatest humiliation of her life. She had used the ashes of her old world to build an empire. She turned in Sebastian's arms, looking up into the eyes of the man who had seen her worth when she had nothing, the man who had burned down a city just to make her smile. "Are you happy, my love?" Sebastian asked softly. Clara smiled, rising onto her tiptoes to press a kiss to his lips. "I am exactly where I was always meant to be." And as the royal guards changed shifts below and the snow began to gently fall over the sovereign nation she now called home, Clara Higgins, the girl who was told she would never be enough, turned her face to the sky and reigned supreme. If you love this story of ultimate revenge and royal vindication, don't keep it to yourself. Smash that like button to show your support for Clara's incredible triumph over her toxic ex. Share this video with a friend who loves a satisfying plot twist and needs to know that karma always comes back around, sometimes wearing a diamond tiara. Want more dramatic, jaw-dropping stories like this one? Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our latest uploads. Thank you for listening, and remember, never settle for less than you deserve.